Hello, it's week 2. Calm theory. Are you excited? I am. I'm going to do a few reminders about what is going on. I know, we've only been in class since Wednesday, even though I posted earlier. And just to get you used to some things, try to get a few things ingrained in your brain so that you know that this is when this is due and this is when that is due. And then I'll talk about these chapters 5 to 13. 5 to 13. And we'll talk about some of the material, and then of course you'll watch the PowerPoints and the narrated PowerPoints and read the textbook for that also. I'm putting this up Sunday, and that's when I try to get most of them done. So not many of you have had a chance to respond to form question 2. It's 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. So usually I kind of draw from those, from your posts, but it's great because there are 2 up that is like, okay, this is right on a calm theory. There are 2 of them about how people talk to people and how people talk differently. And then also one of you mentions this, and I'm not sure if you're the person who mentioned it in the first ones, about what you're interested in is how people communicate the same way in the same situation. That absolutely is in this section. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. So let's just, I'm going to stop here and move the window. Just trying to fool around with the As You Learn site behind you. This system that we use is called Screencast-O-Matic, and it won't let me switch between talking to you and then back to where the intro one that I did. So just a reminder, the syllabus and the weekly schedule are up, and I do follow those. The Watch Me's are second in the on the As You Learn page. I will be moving the introduction and the week 1 Watch Me's down to the bottom. So if you need to go back to them, or God forbid, some of you all did not watch those 2, which some of the questions I'm getting is kind of clear. Some of y'all didn't watch the introductory one. Oops. And then and then just what will be under the Watch Me is that week's Watch Me. The other ones will be down at the bottom of the page. Then form questions. I think that I've gotten everybody to either respond to me, the ones of you all that missed doing it, and will except for one, I haven't heard from one student. But anyway, so they're next. Ingrain this in your brain. They go up usually between 7 and 8, maybe a little early some days, but I'll warn you about that. I have a couple doctor's appointments that are real early in the morning, so I may put it up the night before but leave the other one up. So they go up between 7 and 8. They come down the next morning, all right, between 7 and 8 when I put up the new one. All right. Then on Thursdays, I'll leave them up, all right, until the next Mondays gets put up. So you have a little bit of extra time on the Thursday ones. That's usually because we're crossing over with the test and forum posts. And the next thing on the As You Learn page is the article analysis. There are directions there's written directions. There on the assignment, there's written directions on how to find an article analysis, and there are video directions on where to find the articles, or not article analysis. But there, go look at that because you have one coming up due this Wednesday. All right, and so I'm going to take a minute or 2 and talk about that. All you're doing is Make sure you open the analysis activity, right? Because it tells you what you're doing. You're choosing an article. Sorry, tickle in the throat, needed to cough and drink something. Oops. You're going to choose an article. You're going to read an article. If you're not sure if it's acceptable, you run it by me. The directions tell you how to find an article. All right. So there are many places, right? And it's fine to run it by me and say, is this one okay? Send me the link to it. All right. Send me a copy of it. Save it as a PDF, whatever, and send it to me. What you do is you write a short synopsis of the article, all right? You know, what the study set out to find out. You know, remember, we're talking about confirmation or disconfirmation. We're not setting out to prove something, all right? How they went about finding their results, what their results were, all right? And then any shortcomings of the study. In the studies, they'll call that limitations, all right? They aren't likely. I should probably change that assignment sheet to say any shortcomings or limitations. So then I want you to write a paragraph on how you think that issue that's in that article. Remember, these are communication articles I want you looking for, right? How you think that issue affects the way people communicate, right? And then I want you to write your own analysis of that article and include in it, did you like it? Did you like it? Dislike it? Do you feel it would cause any arguments? And what types of arguments would it cause, etc.? All that is in the description. All right, that's the first thing under the articles. All right, then I tell you the paper writing, the paper requirements: typewritten, double-spaced, attach a copy of the article or the link to it. But you still, even if you do that, you must put the full bibliographic information on the paper. All right, must have bibliographic information anytime you're reporting on something, even if you attach it. All right. And then the first one is due on this Wednesday, all right? And it's the 10th. The sheet says the 11th, but it's the 10th. Everything else says the 10th. I'll go in and fix that. And I do grade grammar. This is a communication department. We expect you to be able to write. And so, yes, I do grade grammar. Okay, went in and fixed that mistake on the assignment sheet for that. Anyway, so it's due Wednesday at midnight. So forum questions, all right, always that by the next morning, 7 to 8, between 7 and 8, and then except for Thursdays, and they stay up until the following Monday, 4 a week, all right. Article analyses are due on Wednesdays, right? There are 3 of them. They're due on Wednesdays at midnight. Then the next section down. Oh, let me remind you that there's a rubric that I use to grade with. Look at that so you know that your paper's got that in it. I also posted some sample articles. You're welcome to use those for ones. I've tried to pick ones that were interesting topics, and you're welcome to use those. I use some of those in the capstone class that I teach, or you can use ones that you find on your own if none of those topics interest you. But still, bibliography, all right, needs to be there. All right. The next section on the As You Learn page are the narrated PowerPoints. Please remember, you should be watching those. Right now, I've just got up through this week. I will, through the end of this week, later, probably Monday, I'll open the ones for next week. They're all there. They're just not visible to you yet, so they didn't become too cumbersome. And then the last section are the tests. Tests, right? Go up on Thursdays around noontime, all right? They can be turned in anytime from that point until Sunday at 5. So you've got 3 different ones to ingrain your brain in. Forum posts by 7 to 8 the next morning. Yeah, I usually leave them up till about 8. Okay, even if I put it up at 7:30, I'll leave it up until around 8. Um, the papers, the article analyses are due at midnights on Wednesdays. Tests are due at 5 p.m. on Sundays. So that's the logistics of the course. And I will be putting the first test up this Thursday, and it'll be due the following Sunday. Save everything as PDFs. Remember, I grade on an iPad Pro, and the software I use requires that I do it with PDFs in order for me to grade on it. So, okay, so that's the housekeeping things. If you have any questions about that, email me or make an appointment to talk to me. I am available, and I can make contact with you. As you can see, I'm sweating. It's because it's Sunday and there's no air conditioning in the building and it's hot. Ah! Okay, let's talk about the chapters that we have for this week. They look like a lot, but keep in mind that they are they're short. They're 8, 10 pages to a chapter, not a 30-page chapter. So we will begin with that now. Sorry, needed to wipe the sweat some. The first topic area that we're going to talk about is interpersonal communication, and that's the first 16, 17 chapters of the textbook. We talk in terms of in the introduction, they talk a good deal to that section. They talk about how we often look at communication as different types of models. We have the bowling model where you send the message and it hits the pins and the message gets there. And then we have the ping pong model where you have a message and it's going back and forth. Okay, so I send a message, you send a message back. I send it, so ping pong. All right. And then we have charades where you're having the back and forth, but people are having input. If you've played charades, you know that they ask questions and do things and try to get you to respond in some way. So feedback is always an important part of that. So we're going to look at these chapters, chapter 5 to 13, just briefly, because believe me, the narrated PowerPoints have tons of information. I don't need to go for overkill, but I do want to point out a few things. Chapter 5 is George Meade's symbolic interactionism. And what this deals with, and he uses some good examples in the textbook, so don't just depend on the narrated PowerPoints. Also depend on the textbook, because they explain it better than perhaps I do on the narrated PowerPoint. So, symbolic actionism just simply means that we communicate through symbolism, through symbols. All right, people talking with each other using symbolic, even language. Words are symbols for something. If I say cat, it's a symbol for something. And what cat means to you may be completely different. In fact, when I teach the seated class of this, I often do that. I go, okay, what comes to mind when I say the word cat? And all 19 of you will probably have a different, well, not completely different, but comes to my mind is I have a little orange kitty, and his name is Mango. And so that's what comes to my mind is a domesticated cat. Some of you may be thinking of the big cats in the zoos and that kind of thing. So when I use a word, it's a symbol. We get it about other symbols. If you see a cross on top of a building, that's a symbol that is a church. All right. And so on. So anyway, there are 3 core principles that I want you to make sure you pay attention to, that symbols have meaning. Language, of course, has meaning, and then thought. So we have meaning, language, and thought that become a part of this concept. This chapter also begins to look at you as the self in that communication process. I versus me. Make sure you read that carefully. What is the difference between I and me in a conversation? I'll ask some questions about that. So And then we also, besides the personal, the self, then we also look at society, about what communicates things to society. And we have to be careful about society because of the generalized other, as Mead calls it, about overgeneralizing. There's a great discussion in the textbook about a sample of applying symbolic interactionism to different situations. So, how we create reality with the symbols that we use. And people doing meaningful research and participant observation that becomes a part of that. And the generalized other, as I just mentioned, naming of things. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Most of y'all have heard that concept before, especially if you've taken a psychology class. And then symbolic manipulation, about how we manipulate symbols to communicate what we want them to communicate, to create our own meanings. So, good ethical discussion there about the ethical reflections, about the I and the me and what's ethical to say and do and communicate. Each chapter, by the way, usually has a critique at the end of it. And these textbook authors kind of throw in a critique in there, usually. For example, they think that this theory is too fluid, that it's not concrete enough. Excuse me. Got that tickle again. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6 has to deal with coordinated management of meaning. Now, this is a simple one. All right. You manage to coordinate meanings with other people when you communicate with them. All right. This is Barnett Pearce and Vernon Cronin's theory. And, this takes us back to the communication model that you would have studied in COM 1200 or in public speaking, about the source, the sender, the message. The channel, the receiver, and those kinds of things. So it takes us back there. Coordinated management of meaning says that we co-construct our own social realities by way of communication with other people. So basically we're creating our own world, but we're also creating the world around us by how we communicate. And it can be nonverbal. Some of y'all have asked some of the questions in your introductions about nonverbals. So, and we'll talk a bit about nonverbal, or nonverbal will be talked quite a bit about in the interpersonal communication section of this textbook. So what Pearson and Cronin, or Cronin and Pearce is what they're more commonly referred to as, is they say that our communication creates our own social worlds. Now that's a no-brainer, but remember, people who are in our own personal social worlds understand better the communication. That's what those of you that are sitting there mentioning, you mentioned it in your intros, and the couple of forum posts that are up have mentioned about how people communicate differently with different people. All right, that's contextual. That's absolutely part of coordinated management of meaning theory. All right, we do communicate that way. We communicate differently with our parents than we do. Now, here comes in where I believe, Chris Fallon, you just mentioned this. There's a concept in communication. It's called the norm of reciprocity. Some materials call it that. Other materials call it dyadic effect. This textbook refers to it as the reciprocal effect. This means that how I communicate with you, I should expect to get in return. So if, I believe your example, Chris, was that you are quiet, all right, and you're sitting there with your spouse, and all of a sudden, your spouse becomes the same type of communication. And it can happen for any type of communication. If I'm a jerk face to you, I should expect you to be a jerk face to me. And oftentimes when someone's a jerk face to me, I sit there and go, okay, did I cause that by something I said or did, or my nonverbals in some way? Okay, so because that's that norm of reciprocity. I'm trying to narrow down in, all right? And that's part of the coordinated management of meaning theory. Uh, and then the second aspect of this chapter deals with the stories we tell and the stories we live, which is a very interesting discussion because a lot of times the stories we tell are not really the stories we live. So make sure you read that and then um, think about it in terms of coordinating meaning, all right, when you read that. Um, and then the third claim of this is of this theory is that we get what we make. All right, and I'm going to tell you that refer back to the norm of reciprocity there. All right, reciprocal. All right, and then they talk in terms of interpersonal theory, saying that there's always a bifurcation point, bifurcation point, bifurcation. All right, and that's a critical point in the conversation where what one says, what you say next, will affect the unfolding pattern of what's going to happen. Norm of reciprocity. So make sure you read that carefully. Good ethical response, and they take us to Buber. Those of you who've studied any ethics, Martin Buber was an ethicist, and it talks about the I, it. You know, I talk to you like you're an object. I, thou, like you're a person. All right, or dialogue. All right. All right. And then there's a concept of the narrow ridge. Am I doing I, it, or am I doing I, thou, or am I walking the narrow ridge between those? All right, which would probably include the dialogue. All right, most of us don't like people who monologue a whole lot. So, a good aspect of this has to do with being relativistic. You know, you cue your communication to the situation, which is fascinating because that's some of the things that some of you all had in your hunches. All right, and or the other two hunches have that in there, as well as in your introductory forum post. And you know, the whole idea is to mesh your meanings. So the critique of this one says that it's highly practical, but it starts out kind of confusing and then moves to clarity. So make sure you read the textbook as well as watch the narrated PowerPoint. So chapter 7 is probably my most favorite because, as I mentioned to you before, I wrote the nonverbal textbook, and I'm in the process of rewriting the next edition of it. And this theory started out in nonverbal communication. It's Judy Burgoon's expectancy violation theory. Okay, simple, all right, but very important. All right, so when I'm communicating with you, I often expect certain communications. You know, let's say you come into my office, you know, and I'm the professor, you're the student. As a professor, I'm probably expecting you to be a little more formal with me than you might be with your friends. Back to that coordination management of meaning, all right? I expect you to be polite. I'm an old woman, as you can see, so maybe a little deference because I am older. All right, and you come in and you're dropping the F-bomb and you're so mad about something, and first of all, you come in and say, hey, which I hate it when people say, hey, and you're not in a position to say, hey. The hey is not a formal way to speak to someone. We have a problem in our culture about we've become so informal that we don't have a clue when we're supposed to be more formal. And so then what happens is that you do that and I'm expecting something else from you and you have violated my expectations. All right. Clear. All right. That part's clear. The next part isn't as clear. What do I do when you violate my expectations? Now I can respond. I can ignore it. I'm likely to, in my classes, I don't allow, seated classes, I don't allow cursing because you don't know who you might offend in the room. It's just, and it's a public forum. You should learn to be in a public forum and not drop the F-bomb every other word. All right. And so and I set that rule out the first day of class. So when somebody in my class violates my class rule, all right, they have violated my expectations. Do I respond? Yes. Actually, what I usually do is go, excuse me? And then I'll say, you can correct yourself, please. Or actually, I usually don't have to say that. They usually get it and they correct themselves immediately. It's just, these are just different types of examples. But that's the bottom line with expectation violation theory. The original ones, and you'll want to read about this, were done in the touch area. That when somebody violated somebody's touch expectations, there could be a negative response, because you can have a negative, all right, violation, or you could have a positive violation. Let's say you hoped somebody would touch you, all right, and they did, all right, but you didn't expect them to, but they did, and you kind of liked it because maybe they were that hot number that you'd been hoping would pay attention to you, all right. All those are expectancy violations, all right. So there are, the concept is called valence, V-A-L-E-N-C-E, and that can be a positive valence or a negative valence. And how much valence is there? If it's a minor, little valence. If somebody came in here and did all that F-bomb drop and something horrible had just happened to them, it would have a lot less negative valence for me than if they just came in here and thought that that was acceptable communication. All right. So anyway, it's a fun theory. You play with it with any area of communication, different types of things. One of the things that happens is we communicate with people and they violate our expectations. It changes our expectations. So the critique is, it's crazy because the theory's been around forever. Looking to see if it tells us the years, but it says a well-regarded work in progress. It's been around forever. So anyway, the ethical reflection has to do with, can we figure out what's right or wrong, good or bad? Okay, that was just some general things about interpersonal communication. The next section in interpersonal communication deals with relationship, development. And so you're going to want to make sure that you pay attention to this, because most of you all do care about how you build your relationships. And, we talk about different types of relationships, friendship, romance, family, all kinds of things. But we talk about the two different approaches to this. And we have the phenomenological approach, which means it's a phenomenon that we deal with. And then the second way is rewards and costs of interaction. Are my rewards worth what it's costing me to be in this relationship? Right. And so they give you some good examples, law of supply and demand and all that good stuff there. And you'll read that in the textbook, the introduction on 94 to 95. And it's in the whatchamacallit, the PowerPoints. Sorry, it's hot in here. Chapter 8, very common, very well-known theory. It's called social penetration theory. It's quite simply that, let's say, they use an onion model, and I don't know what page that's on. That's on page 98 in your textbook. But the whole idea, if you have an onion, all right, within the onion there are layers, all right? And the social penetration theory says that when we first meet people, we have to start on the outer layer, and then we can work our way into the central part. Could be a fast process to move in, could be a slower process the more we get to know. You talk about introverts and extroverts. Introverts, you're more or less likely to move in very quickly into that center, all right? And so the social penetration theory is very common, very well-known theory in our field. And bottom line is self-disclosure, right? Now, I'm going to take you back to the norm of reciprocity with that too. So self-disclosure gives people more depth. We talk about depth, knowing that inner part of you, right? And we talk about breadth, about being able to know just some things about you. But that whole idea of self-disclosure is the bottom line here. And what we get is that back to the norm of reciprocity with self-disclosure. If I self-disclose to you, the assumption, which remember, it's not always great to assume, is that you will also share back with me. You will self-disclose back with me. So that's that norm of reciprocity coming into play there. Your textbook calls it the law of reciprocity. I always call it the norm of reciprocity, the same thing. And then also, by the way, once you get into that onion, you might not like what you find. So guess what? You then depenetrate. You get out of that communication relationship. Another aspect of this theory comes into play is called social exchange theory. And that has to do with the rewards benefit analysis. All right, social exchange theory, perceived rewards and costs it is to you to stay into that relationship. So good discussion in there. That's Altman and Taylor who bring that. We also bring into play here the comparison level, about my communication with your communication. Comparison level for alternatives, like what's out there that might be better for me than what I already have. All right, so comparison level for alternatives, all right, comes into play there too. So make sure that you pay attention to those in the textbook and the PowerPoints. The ethical discussion here is that is it egoism? All right, psychological egoism to talk about, how the depth and breadth about should we act selfishly in order to get more friends or romantic partners or whatever. So the critique has to do with a lot of people think it's far too simplistic. And it might be, but it's still a good theory to apply to communication situations. So it's a fun theory. I think you all will like reading that one. Chapter 9 is also a simple one. It's uncertainty reduction theory. And what this simply says that the more I reduce uncertainty, right, the better able I am going to be able to communicate with you. So basically all that simply deals with is gaining knowledge about your communication partner and creating understanding. It's a no-brainer, all right? So how do you do that? Of course, through communication. We have a tendency to use attribution theory at this point in time. That just simply means we draw inferences about why people do what they do. And by the way, you always want to check that. That's how you reduce uncertainty, is by double checking that. Uncertainty reduction is simply increased knowledge of what kind of person another is going to provide you with an improved forecast of how to communicate with that person and how that interaction will turn out. Sorry, needed to wipe the sweat again. There are some axioms, A-X-I-O-M-S. All that means, folks, is principles. All right, the word axiom means principle. All right, so axioms are principles. So there are some principles that come into play in this uncertainty reduction. Verbal communication, nonverbal communication, information seeking, meaning you ask questions, self-disclosing, reciprocity, similarity, liking, shared networks. All those things help you reduce uncertainty. And you can ask yourself, or you can ask somebody else about it, and you'll read about that, all right? let's say you see that hot number, all right, and you want to find out more about them. Do you go up and ask them, or do you ask somebody else who might know them? All right, so that's all part of this. And some good things about message plans. We all do it. You plan out that in your brain what you're going to say to the person when you're going to talk to them. And what do you do with that plan? Do you actually use it, or do you hedge your bets, as they call it, hedging? Uh, there are some shortcomings about doing the using the model of communicating more to get to know people more. About how much do you know about your partner, your relational uncertainty, partner interference, when the person that the communication partner, that doesn't necessarily mean romantic partner. I think we often think about that in terms of that term. And then what if there's turbulence in the relationship? So the critique is kind of mamby-pamby in my book, but it's they say that nagging doubts about it. All right, but I think it's a good theory. Chapter 10, social information processing theory, is what do you do with the information that you find out? Now this is the chapter on computer-mediated communication. CMC, we refer to this as in our field, all right? And CMC is a fairly new theory, but it talks about, do we communicate as well using computer-mediated communication? And research says yes, we do, all right? Sorry. There are some other theories that come into play here because of this: social presence theory, media richness theory, and a lack of social context cues. And that's more in the written, because now we do FaceTime or Skype or Zoom or other ones where you actually see the person, more so than when this theory was first brought about. Make sure you look at the chapter. There's a chaining situation about interpersonal information, impression formation, and relationship development. All right, and we do form impressions. It's that cyber identity that we talk about. It has to do with using many forms of computer-mediated communication. Can nonverbal cues or verbal cues in written communication, like email, I ask you all to email me professionally, all right, and to post your forums professionally. Y'all haven't seen each other face to face, all right, so what's being communicated about you by the writing that you're putting on the forums? So this is all part of it. There is one thing that a lot of people don't realize. A lot of people say you can't build as strong a relationship through computer-mediated communication as you can through face-to-face, and they say that's not true. There have been studies, so you might want to look that up for one of your article analyses if that interests you. There's an aspect of warranting value, and that has to do with whether or not the information that you get is true. How many of you, your social media presence really reflects the true you, is what that talks about. And then the critique just simply is that it's a growing field, computer-mediated communication. Just 3 more to go. You'll be fine. This one's a little long, I know, but I got to get the long one in the beginning instead of us trying to shove it all in at the end. So this last section on the interpersonal communication for this week is relationship maintenance, all right? And what that deals with is, how do you maintain, all right? Some good things about general things like being more positive, being more open, assuring your communication partner, networking, sharing tasks, all of that, right? So relationship maintenance is an important part of once you've built that relationship. Dialectics, relational dialectics is chapter 11. And Baxter and Montgomery are the authors of this theory. And what that simply means is that every relationship you have is going to have tensions. How do you deal with the tensions is what this theory deals with. All right. So dialectics, tensions, conflicts, clashes, interactions, etc. And so when a relationship has those, what do? Do you only tell yourself? Do you tell the person you're having the relational dialectic issue come up? There are three main dialectics that affect relationships, and they're continuums: integration versus separation. Do we talk about it, or do we just separate? Do we not talk to each other about it? Stability, do we stay the same we are, or do we make a change? All right. And then expression or non-expression. Do we tell the person, or do we not tell the person? So those are important aspects of this. The biggest issue has to do with dialectics is dialogue, all right? Because you can't deal usually very well with a tense situation without some sort of dialogue. So there's a good discussion in the textbook. Bakhtin, I never say that name, right, is the person who looks more at the dialoguing to take care of the tensions that get raised in relationships. The biggest issue here is the principle of veracity, and that deals with being truthful in relationships. So if you're going to communicate, you need to be truthful. Duh, right? Of course, sometimes the truth hurts, so you have to realize that there are ways to go about being truthful. Chapter 12 is a communication privacy management theory that deals with privacy boundaries. Right? What do you keep private and what do you tell other people? There are lots of you all that have relationships, but a number of you all are married. All right. And so what do you do? What gets told? How many of you remember growing up, your parents saying, don't tell so-and-so, right? What happens, all right? You know the boundaries. You've been told the boundaries. If you don't, you want to make sure you know what the boundaries are in your relationships, right? And then what happens when those boundaries get violated, right? And, what is private information? What is privacy? What are the rules in your relationships? Because rule-based, I'm going to ask you a form question about rules in privacy, or a test question, or both. All right. Once you disclose information to someone, though, don't forget they have ownership of it too. That's called co-ownership. So you have to deal with that. So in relationships, it's your job to do what they talk about: coordinating mutual privacy boundaries. All right. And then you talk about boundary turbulence. What happens when you violate? What happens when you violate? And then chapter 13 is the interactional view, and this looks at communication like a family system. All right. Family homeostasis, the collusion of family members to maintain the status quo. And it's called the interactional view. I would say Václavic, but I speak Polish, so Václavic is how most people in America probably say it. But this deals with more principles of interpersonal communication. And these are the general ones that we talk about. One, cannot not communicate. Communication is equal to content and relationship. There's always content, but there's always relationship also. This is what a number of you all have mentioned in your posts. The nature of the relationship is to punctuate the communication sequence. This is part, punctuate. This is next, punctuation, etc. All right. All communication is either symmetrical or complementary. And so symmetrical is equality, equal power in the situation. Complementary is based on us accepting differences of power. And then this is the section that deals with one up, one down, and one across communication. Make sure you learn what those are. We know, that one up communication is where somebody's trying to gain control. All right. One down communication is where you're trying to yield control, and one across is where there's even. The critique of this is that it's an old theory, and so that adjustments need to be made to new situations. So those are the chapters. I know this was long. So, and as Olive said in the announcement that it's posted, you can watch it in chapter type of thing instead of sitting for 45 minutes to watch the whole thing. So anyway, if you have questions, just ask me. Don't forget, forums are due by 7-8 the next morning. Your paper is going to be due by Wednesday at midnight. And yes, you may use those sample articles or go find one. I've given you directions how to do that. Test will go up at noon on Thursday. All right. And will be due by 5 p.m. Sunday. You'll get more reminders about that. Have a great week and let me know where you have questions.